Thank you for joining us today for this event about Californians' attitudes about the perceptions of environmental issues. I'm Mark Baldassari, President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, PPIC is a nonpartisan think tank with offices in San Francisco and here in Sacramento. This event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we would like to thank them for making it possible to bring this program to you today. This particular study was conducted with funding from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and we'd also like to thank them for making this program possible today. You should have found a 2-page handout on your chair that features some of the key findings from the survey. It's this one. And you can also look on our website for the full survey report, which is published there today. A couple of more things before we begin. The briefing slides for today's presentation will be available on our website. And I'm reminding myself for this one too, please turn off your cell phone for the presentation or silence it in some way. And finally, you should have an evaluation survey on your chair. Please fill this out and drop it off at the registration table on your way out. And now we turn to today's program. It's my pleasure to introduce Sonja Petek, who is a research associate at PPIC and was the project manager for this latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and the environment. Her presentation will be followed by a Q&A. I'll now turn it over to Sonja.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is great. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is always nice. And before I get started going into the findings, for those of you who haven't been to one of these briefings or are less familiar with the statewide survey, I want to just provide a little bit of background about what the survey is. It was started in 1998 by Survey Director Mark Baldassari, and the goal really was to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on the social, economic, and political opinions of Californians. And by doing so, we hope to inform and improve the state policy-making process and provide a voice for Californians. And since 1998, we've interviewed over 286,000 Californians in 136 surveys. The current survey on Californians and the environment, as Mark mentioned, was conducted with funding from the Hewlett Foundation, to whom we're grateful for their support. And this is actually the 13th annual survey that we've conducted on environmental issues since 2000. The survey this year was conducted from July 9th through the 23rd. It's a telephone survey. It includes surveys on both landline phones and cell phones. And it's conducted in multiple languages. We do all our surveys in both English and Spanish. And this survey also included interviews in Asian languages, Chinese, both Mandarin and Cantonese, Korean, and Vietnamese. We interviewed about 2,100 California adults, I should say. And in that group, we defined close to 1,300 as likely voters, or those, we look at voter registration, frequency of voting, and some other questions to determine who is most likely to show up at the polls. And the margin of error for all adults is plus or minus 3% and higher for some of the subgroups that I'll be mentioning throughout the presentation. And I just wanted to mention some of the topical matters we wanted to focus on this year. We took a look at Californians' perceptions of global warming and also their preferences for how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we also asked a number of questions about energy policy to see where Californians stood on those issues. And then we wanted to get a sense of what Californians think the role of government is in these issues, and also to gauge approval ratings of elected officials. And just real quickly, the context in which our survey was conducted this year, the the timing, the July 9th through 23rd timing, put us after President Obama had made his speech about global warming and released his climate action plan. It was conducted in the midst of some pretty severe wildfires. Right before our survey began, the state budget was passed, and the revenues from the cap and trade program had been loaned to the state's general fund, but discussions were still ongoing about how to invest these revenues in the future. And then the survey also, we took a look at the sort of controversial issues of fracking and building the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, so I'll quit boring you with the details about the the background of the survey and get on to some of the findings. So, as we have found in previous years, Californians really are not on the fence about whether global warming is real. We find that 63% think that the effects of global warming have already begun to happen. Another 22% say that these effects will happen at some point in the future, either in their lifetimes or affect future generations. And then really only about 1 in 10 Californians say that the effects of global warming will never happen. And we like to, when possible, see how Californians compare to adults nationwide. And this question, which we've been asking since 2005, comes from a national Gallup poll that they also, they ask this question each year as well. And even though Californians are more likely to think the effects of global warming have already begun to happen, even in Gallup's poll, only 15% say that the effects will never happen. They have had a slight decline in their numbers since the Great Recession. And then briefly, I would just mention that we do have big differences by party, and you'll see this on a number of our questions that gauge perceptions of global warming. Democrats far more likely than Republicans to say that the effects of global warming have already begun to happen. And here's another example of where there are some partisan divisions. We ask this question each year about when Californians think steps should be taken to counter the effects of global warming. And this is actually one of the charts on your handout, if you want to take a closer look at that. But we find overall that 75% of Californians think that it's necessary to take steps right away to counter the effects of global warming. Just 21% say that it's not necessary to take steps yet. But you can see that since 2003, there has been a sort of growing political divide on this issue, with Democrats and independents much more likely than Republicans to think that steps should be taken right away. But you can see that since last year, there has been a slight increase in the share of Republicans now holding this view. And in fact, we noticed this on a number of questions this year, that there have been increases in the share of Republicans expressing support for some of the policies and in some of the preferences, or perceptions rather. We come at the issue of global warming from a number of different perspectives. So this question helps us understand how serious Californians think the threat of global warming is to the state's future economy and quality of life. And we find that sort of reflecting the urgency that Californians express about taking steps to counter global warming, we also find that a strong majority consider global warming to be a serious threat to the state's future. Half consider it to be a very serious threat. But you can see from this slide that there are some striking differences across racial and ethnic groups, with Latinos and African Americans about 20 points more likely than Asians or whites to consider this threat very serious. This is a question that we started asking in 2003, and since that time we've found that strong majorities of Californians say that the threat of global warming is either very or somewhat serious. The survey also included 4 questions about some of the possible impacts of global warming. This year we included questions about more severe wildfires, more severe droughts, increased flooding, and more severe storms as possible impacts of global warming. We find Californians are most likely to be very concerned about more severe wildfires, followed by more severe droughts. Fewer express this level of concern about flooding or more severe storms, but we do, I guess what this chart doesn't show, we do find a good number of Californians saying they're somewhat concerned about flooding and storms. We started asking about wildfires in 2009, and the results have been similar to what they are today in the levels of concern. We started asking about floods and droughts in 2005. We found that concern peaked in 2007. That was during one of the state's worst droughts. Also, when we look at these questions across racial and ethnic groups, we again see a similar trend as in other questions where concern is higher among Latinos and African Americans about each of these issues. And the concern about wildfires was highest in the Inland Empire, which was experiencing a severe fire during the fielding period. And in signs of an improving economy, and again reflecting the sense of urgency Californians express about the threat of global warming, we find that a record share of Californians say that the state should act right away on its plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, rather than waiting for the economy and job situation to improve. I think what's interesting about this question is that when we started asking this in July. Well, we actually started asking a very similar question in July 2008. At that time, we had phrased it, instead of job situation, it was budget situation. But we've been asking this specific question since July 2010. And we always found that Californians were more likely to say that the state should act on its plans to reduce emissions rather than waiting for the economy to improve. And I think that in particular, in July 2010, this helps explain perhaps why Prop 23 failed at the ballot in the November election. Californians don't necessarily see, in another question I'm going to show how Californians don't even necessarily see this goal as related to declines in job numbers. Not surprisingly, we find that Democrats are the most likely to say that the state should act right away. But interestingly, I did want to note the share of Republicans who say the state should act right away is up 14 points from last year, which is perhaps one of the things driving the overall increase. We included 2 new questions in the survey this year. We wanted to get a general sense of the importance Californians place on sort of the idea of both reducing global warming and preparing for the future effects of global warming. We find that 8 in 10 Californians consider both of these goals to be at least somewhat important. We phrased it as, how important is it for the state to pass regulations and spend money now on efforts to reduce global warming? Or the second question was to prepare for the future effects of global warming, such as storms, wildfires, and flooding. Now, we do find that certain groups are more likely, however, to say that this goal is very important. Democrats, residents in the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, and San Francisco Bay Area, and again, Latinos and African Americans. But we do find that majorities across all the state's political, regional, and demographic groups consider these goals at least somewhat important. On California's landmark piece of legislation, AB 32, we find that very strong support among Californians overall, at 67% for the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020. We also find strong support among likely voters for this goal. But this is another interesting question where you see evidence of a sort of political polarization on the issue. So when we first started asking about AB 32 in 2006, right before it was signed into law, 2/3 across parties said that they favored the goal behind AB 32. By July 2010, there was a 41-point gap between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. And again, this was right at the time that Proposition 23 to sort of put a halt on AB 32 was on November ballot. But we've seen that the share of Republicans expressing favor for this goal has increased 10 points since that time, and we now have a 28-point gap between parties. And interestingly, this year we do find the lowest level of independents. This is the lowest level of support that we've found among independents, but still quite high at 63%. And as I alluded to earlier, I think that perhaps one of the reasons Californians don't think the state should put off its plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is that they don't necessarily see a negative effect on jobs if the state does things to address global warming. In fact, we find 66% of Californians either think that more jobs will result from the state doing things to reduce global warming, or they don't think there will be an effect on job numbers. We have asked this question since July 2010, and the results have been remarkably similar each year. And we do find that Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to think that more jobs would result from this type of action. But even among Republicans, a majority think that either more jobs will result or there will be no effect on jobs. The survey included 6 different questions about ways that state and federal government could try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm just going to walk you through the battery of questions, starting with these 2. We find strong support and majority bipartisan support for the idea of requiring an increase in energy efficiency for residential and commercial buildings and appliances. We also find very strong support among both adults and likely voters for the idea of encouraging local governments to change their land use planning so that people could drive less. Both of these ideas have been very popular since we started asking these questions in July 2008. I mentioned that there was bipartisan majority support, and we have actually seen an increase, again, evidence that some of the political things have been changing a little bit. We saw an increase of 7 points among Republicans for the idea of increasing energy efficiency. Two other questions that we posed to respondents was the idea of requiring industrial plants, oil refineries, and commercial facilities to reduce their emissions, and then a new question this year on the idea of setting stricter emissions limits on power plants. And as you may know, the idea of regulating power plants is something that the president proposed in his climate action plan released at the end of June. California, already has these types of limits in place, but the idea of doing it at the federal level would be new. We've found that since 2008, more than 70% have expressed support for the idea of requiring industrial plants, oil refineries, and commercial facilities to reduce emissions. The question we asked this year on setting stricter emissions on power plants was adapted from a question that was conducted nationally by the Pew Research Center. They asked this in February and found that 62% of adults nationwide favored this idea. So pretty high support, but not as high as in California. And then our last 2 questions had to do with requiring oil companies to produce transportation fuels with lower emissions, or requiring automakers to further reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases from new cars. The question on requiring oil companies to produce fuels with lower emissions was a new one in the survey this year. And we find very strong support. 8 in 10 adults and likely voters favor this idea, including at least 64% across political parties. And we find that more than 3 in 4 adults and likely voters favor the idea of reducing emissions from new cars. We've been tracking attitudes toward this policy idea since 2002, when AB 1493, the Clean Cars Act, was just being passed. And we found very strong support since that time. And that, as you probably know, that act really became a model for other states and for federal legislation on auto emissions. The survey included a number of questions about the cap-and-trade program, which is, one of the key ways that the state is seeking to reduce emissions to meet the goals of AB 32. And although, as I mentioned earlier, although the revenues are being loaned to the general fund this year, we did want to ask for residents' opinions about how the revenue should be spent in the future. But first, we wanted to start by asking whether they even knew about cap and trade. So despite the program really being fully rolled out at this point, majority of Californians, 54%, have heard nothing about the cap and trade program. And these results are identical to what we found in 2010 and 2012. So there hasn't been any growth in awareness over the last few years. We do find some differences in level of awareness among some of the state's subgroups. So, for example, among likely voters, 61% said that they had heard either a lot or a little about cap and trade. And we find that across racial and ethnic groups, whites are the most likely to be aware of the program. And awareness does increase with rising education and income levels, as well as its awareness is greater among older residents. Now, the cap and trade revenues, certain percentages are supposed to be spent to improve environmental conditions in the state's disadvantaged areas. It's 25% has to be spent to benefit people living in those areas, and 10% must be spent on projects actually located in disadvantaged communities. And so we wanted to get a sense from Californians how important they thought this goal was. And we find that more than 8 in 10 Californians say that it's at least somewhat important, with 52% saying that this is a very important goal. But there are very big differences, as you can see from this slide, across racial and ethnic groups, with African Americans and Latinos far more likely to consider these investments very important. And we see across income groups that the share saying that it's very important decreases sharply as income levels rise. So people with lower incomes far more likely to consider this a very important goal. And we also see differences in the state's regions. So for example, Los Angeles and Inland Empire residents are the most likely to consider this goal very important, whereas residents in Orange and San Diego counties, which, as we know, are more affluent areas, are the least likely to consider this goal very important. And we also included several follow-up questions about how people would prioritize the cap and trade revenue investments. So this isn't shown in this slide here, but before we asked these 3 questions, we asked a question about what they perceive as the top priority for spending the revenues, because the cap and trade revenues will likely be spent in 3 main areas: transportation and housing infrastructure, energy efficiency and clean energy projects, and natural resources and waste diversion projects. So we basically posed a question to respondents: which of these 3 areas do you consider the top priority for investing cap and trade revenues? We found pretty mixed results among residents. Natural resources and waste management get the lowest share, and about 1/3 say that they would the top priority should be transportation and housing infrastructure, and another third say this about clean energy projects. So then we asked, transportation and housing infrastructure are likely to get a larger share of the revenues because transportation accounts for the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So we asked 3 follow-ups about just possible ideas for how to spend revenues in this area. And we found that each idea was quite popular with Californians, especially the idea of spending cap and trade revenues on public transit projects, including more buses or reduced transit fares. We also found the idea of repaving roads and highways to be very popular. And 6 in 10 Californians also said they would favor spending on housing and commercial developments around mass transit hubs. The first two ideas, the public transit and roads and highways ideas, get majority bipartisan support, whereas Republicans are sort of divided on this last issue about investments near transit hubs. And then I wanted to present some of the findings about energy policy. So the survey continued to track attitudes about coastal oil drilling. So let's take a look at this time trend. We find that opposition to allowing more drilling off the California coast is up somewhat since last year. And basically, when we started asking this question in 2005, we found that Californians were more likely to oppose than favor the idea of allowing more drilling. We saw these opinions sort of flip in 2008 and 2009 for the first time. And as you recall, of course, 2008 was a presidential election in which oil drilling really became a hot campaign issue. But then, of course, the BP oil spill happened, and we saw opposition spike by July 2010. And somewhat surprisingly, opinions had narrowed right back down by the following year in 2011. But this year we do see an increase in opposition. And again, some of this has to do with the fact that support for oil, although a majority of Republicans support the idea of allowing more oil drilling, we have seen a decline since last year, a 15-point decline in support among Republicans. We also take a look at this question among our coastal residents versus our inland residents, and we find majority opposition along the north and central coast and a slim majority opposition on the south coast, whereas residents in more inland areas are divided on the issue. The survey's also been tracking opinions about the idea of building more nuclear power plants in California. And this is interesting. The findings on nuclear power this year are unchanged from last year. They're identical. And this is even following the closure of the San Onofre power plant in San Diego County. And again, this is an interesting time trend because when we first started asking the question in 2005, a pretty solid majority of Californians were opposed to the idea, and these opinions started to narrow over the next several years. And then the disaster happened in Japan, and we saw opposition spike. And then opinion has stayed the same since that time. We do find that majorities across parties oppose the idea of building more nuclear power plants. Last year we found Republicans were more divided on the issue. 50% actually expressed support for this idea. This year, majority are opposed. And then across regions, we find that favor for building more nuclear power plants, even though a majority across regions are opposed to the idea, support is highest in Orange and San Diego counties. We find really high levels of support among Californians for investments in renewable energy projects at the federal level. We also find that Californians favor the state's goal of having a third of its electricity come from renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power by the year 2020. We do ask a follow-up on this question, however. If they support it, would they continue to support it if it meant an increase in their own electricity bill? And we find that support does decline quite a bit. 44% of Californians and 48% of likely voters would be in favor of this idea, even if they had to pay a higher electricity bill, whereas a pretty sizable share would favor it, but not if it cost them more. We started asking this question in 2008 and have found fairly similar results each time. And across parties, this is interesting because we do find a majority across parties say that they would favor the idea in general, but then support drops about 30 points in each of the party groups if it would mean a higher electricity bill. So now I'd like to address a couple of the more, the newer controversial energy policies, starting with fracking. So we find a slim majority of Californians say that they oppose the idea of increased fracking. 35% are in favor. And among likely voters, they're also more likely to be opposed to the idea. This question also came from a national survey by the Pew Research Center. In March, they found that adults nationwide were more likely to express support for fracking at 48%. In our survey, we find that a majority of Democrats are opposed to the idea. Half of Republicans are in favor, while 35% are opposed, and independents are divided. As the state legislature has proposed some bills to try to regulate the practice of fracking in the state, we wanted to ask sort of a general question about this idea. We find that 50% of Californians say that they would favor stricter state regulation of fracking in California. 36% are opposed. But what's interesting, among those who would favor increased use of fracking in the state, 62% would also favor stricter state regulation of the practice. And then we included a question about building the Keystone Pipeline that would transport oil from Canada to refineries in Texas. And we find a slim majority of Californians and likely voters say that they would favor this idea. This was also another Pew question, and when they asked this in March, they found much higher support nationwide at 66% for the idea of building the Keystone Pipeline. There are sizable, as you can see, partisan differences on this issue, with 7 in 10 Republicans saying they favor the idea of building the pipeline, Democrats more likely to oppose than favor it, and a majority of independents saying that they favor this idea. Okay, so let's take a look at how Californians are rating their elected officials on some of these issues. So, the speculation has been sort of swirling about whether Governor Brown is going to run for re-election. Our survey finds that about half of Californians say that they approve of his overall job performance, and we've found similar numbers since the election last fall. But what's interesting this survey is that a record high 54% of likely voters express approval of Governor Brown's overall performance. When we asked how he's handling environmental issues, we find a lower share of Californians, 39%, say that they approve of the job that he's doing. But we also find a higher number of people saying that they're unsure of what he's doing in this area. He hasn't been too vocal about it. And when we look at the legislature's ratings, we find fewer than 4 in 10 approve of either its overall job performance or its handling of environmental issues. But to put this in perspective, last July, when we asked about the legislature's overall approval ratings, approval was 7 points lower than it is today. The ratings on environmental issues have been similar the previous 2 times we asked this question, in July 2011 and 12. We also asked Californians to weigh in on President Obama and the U.S. Congress. And really, since about March 2012, we've found about 6 in 10 Californians expressing approval of the way that President Obama is handling his job overall. And again, this is another question where we wanted to compare Californians' attitudes to those of adults nationwide. And ABC News and Washington Post conducted a survey that happened right during the same dates as our interviews were conducted. And they found that 49% of adults nationwide express approval of President Obama. We find voters in California are divided sharply along partisan lines about how President Obama is doing his job. And among likely voters, we find 54% expressing approval. But again, similar to what we noticed with Governor Brown, we find that fewer Californians express approval of the way that he's handling environmental issues in the United States. But again, more people are also say that they're unsure of how to rate him in this area. And it probably will not surprise you that the U.S. Congress receives very low approval ratings among Californians. We just find 3 in 10 saying that they approve of their job overall, as well as their handling of environmental issues. But may come as a surprise. Californians are more positive than adults nationwide. This kind of surprised me. The ABC News Washington Post poll found only 21% approval for Congress. So, and this is an area of bipartisan agreement. We find majority disapproval of Congress on both these issues. But we also wanted to get a sense of how Californians rate the government, the different levels of government's response to the issue of global warming. And we find that a majority of Californians say that they think the federal government is not doing enough to address the issue of global warming. These results on the federal government were similar last year, but down from a high of 66% in July 2008. We also find pluralities, 44% on both state and federal government, saying that these levels of government are also not doing enough. But again, these percentages are slightly lower than 2008. On each of these questions, a majority of Democrats feel that the response is inadequate at each level of government, and a plurality of independents agree. A plurality of Republicans believe that the federal government is not doing enough, but offer more mixed views about state and local government. And then the survey's been tracking for quite some time attitudes toward regional air pollution. So we included a few questions again in this survey to find out whether residents consider air pollution to be a big problem where they live. We find that overall 61% of Californians consider air pollution in their region to be a big problem or somewhat of a problem. And these findings have been fairly similar over the past several years. But as you can see here, and it's not surprising given that their air quality is worse, residents in the Inland Empire and Los Angeles are the most likely to consider air pollution a big problem in their region, and Central Valley residents more likely than San Francisco Bay Area and Orange San Diego County residents to hold this view. And then in another question, we also wanted to find out whether people think that regional air pollution poses a serious health threat to them and their immediate families. We find that 52% of Californians say that it does pose either a very serious or somewhat serious threat to them and their families, 22% saying very serious. But we see that similar trends across regions emerge with residents in the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, and Central Valley, the most likely to consider air pollution to be a very serious health threat. We also find that Latinos and African Americans, they're not only more likely to consider regional air pollution a big problem, but they're also more likely to consider it a very serious health threat. And lower income residents are more likely to hold this view. And then we also wanted to find out, well, do residents think that within their region, air pollution is worse for certain areas than others? And we find that among all adults, 48% say that the air pollution in the lower income areas of their region is worse, or rather poses a more serious health threat than other areas in their region. And again, you can see there's a pretty stark difference of opinion across racial and ethnic groups about this issue. And we also see, again, the same trends emerging across income groups and by region. Well, actually, region is an interesting one on this, too. I should mention that in the Central Valley, a majority of residents say that air pollution is not worse in lower income areas. So, and that you don't know. That could be a perception that air pollution is posing a serious health threat to everybody. Okay. So just to briefly conclude, and then Mark and I are happy to take any of your questions. As we've found in previous years, most think that global warming is a serious threat to the state's future, and we find a record share of Californians today saying that the state should take action on its plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rather than waiting for better economic times and improved job numbers. And we do find that a strong majority of Californians continue to support the goal of AB 32. And we find bipartisan majority support for a number of the ways that state and federal government can try and reduce emissions. This year we find an increase in opposition to oil drilling and more than 6 in 10 saying they oppose the idea of building more nuclear power plants. And then interestingly, conflicted views about fracking and the Keystone Pipeline, a slim majority opposing fracking, but a similar share favoring building the Keystone Pipeline. And then, as I mentioned several times throughout the presentation, we do find that among Latinos and African Americans, there are higher concerns about global warming. They're also more likely to perceive disparities in regional air pollution. Oh, and before I forget, I wanted to mention, you can run a lot of these findings for yourself on our website. We have an online tool that lets you look at each of these questions, and you can run it by region, race, ethnicity, income, education, party, etc. So I encourage you to visit our website and check out any of these detailed findings for yourself.